The rain hit the windows of the Edgewater Hotel in Seattle like tiny fists demanding to be let in. Meg Torres wiped down the last stainless steel counter in the staff pantry on the third floor, her rubber gloves squeaking against the metal surface with a sound that reminded her of childhood balloons losing air. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, and the building had that peculiar silence that only comes when guests are either deeply asleep or pretending to be, when the fluorescent lights hum a pitch lower, when even the elevator cables seem to breathe more quietly. She pulled off her gloves and dropped them into the small trash bin by the service entrance, feeling the ache in her lower back that had been her constant companion for the past 8 years. 8 years of bending, lifting, restocking minibar refrigerators, carrying trays of coffee supplies through narrow corridors that smelled perpetually of industrial carpet, cleaner, and something else, something like old ambition mixed with resignation. Her reflection in the polished steel of the industrial refrigerator showed a woman of 43 with crow's feet that seemed deeper under these lights. Dark hair pulled back so tightly her temples pulsed, and eyes that had learned to notice everything while appearing to see nothing at all. The rain intensified, and somewhere in the building's bones, the old wooden beams beneath layers of renovation, something creaked. The Edgewater was one of Seattle's iconic waterfront hotels, built partially over Elliott Bay itself, and on nights like this, you could feel the water beneath you, moving, restless, as if the building were a ship that had forgotten it was anchored. Meg grabbed her worn canvas tote bag from the hook by the door, checked that her phone was inside battery at 23%, she noted with mild irritation, and switched off the pantry lights. The service corridor stretched before her like a throat, walls painted that particular shade of institutional beige that exists nowhere in nature, punctuated every 15 feet by emergency exit signs that cast everything in a sickly green glow. Her white sneakers, the ones with the torn mesh near the left big toe, made soft padding sounds against linoleum that had been waxed too many times, creating an uneven surface that caught light in strange ways. She could hear the building's heartbeat, the distant hum of the industrial laundry in the basement, the periodic whoosh of the HVAC system pushing heated air through ducts, and the rain, always the rain, drumming its relentless rhythm against skylights she couldn't see but knew were there, somewhere above, where guests never looked. Meg had taken perhaps 20 steps when she heard it, footsteps that weren't hers. They came from ahead, around the corner, where the service corridor made a sharp left turn toward the freight elevator. But these weren't the heavy, tired footsteps of housekeeping staff finishing their shifts. These were measured, quick, purposeful, the sound of dress shoes with leather soles, the kind that cost more than Meg made in a week. She slowed instinctively, her body responding before her mind fully processed why. In 8 years, she had learned the unspoken rule of service workers everywhere: make yourself invisible when management appears. She pressed herself slightly toward the wall, not hiding exactly, but creating space, becoming part of the corridor's furniture. And then she saw him. Victor Ashford emerged from a section of wall that Meg had passed 1,000 times without truly seeing. The door was so perfectly flush with the beige paint, its hinges so carefully concealed, that it existed more as an absence than a presence, a door that wasn't supposed to be noticed. Victor, general manager, 52 years old, always impeccably dressed, with silver hair that looked like it had been disciplined into submission, pulled the door, closed behind him, with a gentleness that seemed almost tender. He used an old-fashioned brass key, the kind Meg associated with vintage movies, and the soft click of the lock, engaging, sounded absurdly loud in the quiet corridor. He hadn't seen her yet, Meg stood absolutely still, hardly breathing, watching as Victor tucked the brass key into his vest pocket. He always wore a vest, charcoal grey, with a gold watch chain that caught light like a warning. His face, in profile, wore an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the professional smile he displayed for guests, not the stern efficiency he showed staff. This was something else, a combination of satisfaction and profound weariness, like a man who had just finished some task he both enjoyed and hated. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Meg debated. Turn back to the pantry and pretend she hadn't seen anything. Continue walking as if she belonged here, as if she had every right to witness whatever this was. But her feet made the decision for her, continuing their soft padding forward, and the slight scuff of her worn sole against linoleum made Victor's head snap toward her. His expression transformed instantly. The weariness vanished, replaced by the mask of professional courtesy. But not before Meg saw something flicker in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or concern. Meg, he said, and his voice had that warm, slightly condescending tone he used with staff who weren't management. Working late tonight. It wasn't a question, and Meg understood she wasn't supposed to answer as if it were. Just finished the 3rd floor pantry, Mr. Ashford, she said, keeping her voice neutral. Her eyes respectfully lowered. All the small performances that made people like Victor comfortable with people like her. Headed out now. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, seen but not truly noticed, then you understand what Meg felt in that corridor. And if this story resonates with you, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. It helps us continue sharing stories that matter. Stories about people whose voices deserve to be heard. Now back to that rainy Seattle night, where everything was about to change. Victor nodded, already moving past her. His expensive cologne something woody and assertive, trailing behind him like a claim of territory. Good work, he said automatically, not really speaking to her but rather checking off a box in some internal management protocol. His shoes clicked away down the corridor, each step a period at the end of sentences Meg would never be invited to read. She waited until the sound faded completely, until even the echo of his presence had been absorbed by the beige walls. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a force that surprised her. She hadn't realized how tense she'd been until the danger passed. Danger. Why had her body labeled it danger? Victor was just the general manager doing whatever general managers did late at night in luxury hotels, except that his expression, that unguarded moment before he'd noticed her, had contained something that didn't match the official story everyone told themselves about this place. Meg looked at the section of wall where the door hid. In the greenish emergency light, she could barely make out its outline, a rectangle of shadow slightly darker than the surrounding paint. Hinges concealed behind trim that matched the baseboard perfectly. She took 2 steps closer, then 3. Her fingertips found the seam where door met frame, feeling the slight gap that shouldn't exist in a wall, but did exist in a doorway. There was no handle on this side, just smooth painted wood that had been touched so many times the paint had worn down to primer in one small spot, right where someone's hand would naturally press. The rational part of Meg's brain, the part that had kept her employed and invisible for 8 years, the part that understood how power worked in places like this, elevates her to walk away, go to the freight elevator, clock out, drive home to her studio apartment in Rainier Valley, where her cat, Senior Whiskers, would be sitting on the windowsill waiting, his orange fur outlined by streetlight. Heat up leftover chicken and rice. Watch something mindless on Netflix until her eyes grew heavy. Wake up tomorrow and do it all again. But there was another part of Meg, smaller and quieter, that had been filing away injustices like receipts in a shoebox. The part that we remembered when Jalissa from housekeeping had been fired for taking 2 unopened bottles of water from a room that was being completely restocked anyway. The part that knew Marco in maintenance worked 70-hour weeks, but somehow his overtime never quite appeared on his paycheck. The part that had watched Victor give a speech at the staff meeting about family values and pulling together right before announcing that holiday bonuses would be restructured, which meant eliminated for everyone below supervisor level. That part of Meg pressed her palm flat against the hidden door and pushed very gently. It didn't move. Locked, of course. The brass key was in Victor's vest pocket, probably already floors away. Meg exhaled slowly, feeling foolish. What had she expected? The door to swing open magically, revealing ... What? She didn't even know what she'd imagined finding. A storage closet, probably. Extra linens. Broken furniture waiting to be discarded. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that explained the expression on Victor's face, or the careful gentleness with which he'd locked it. She was turning to leave when she noticed something that made her breath catch. The door didn't sit quite flush with the floor. There was a gap not large, maybe half an inch, and in that gap, light leaked out. Not bright light, but a subtle glow, amber-toned, like the light from an old-fashioned lamp. Someone had left a light on, or something electrical was running inside. Either way, it meant the room wasn't just a dead storage space. It was active, used, important enough to light. Meg crouched down, her knees protesting the movement, and pressed her cheek against the cold linoleum. Through the gap, she could see only a thin slice of the room beyond, what looked like dark wood flooring, possibly mahogany or walnut, completely unlike the industrial surfaces everywhere else in the service areas. And something else, the corner of what might be a rug, deep burgundy, with a pattern woven in gold thread, expensive, completely out of place. The rational part of her brain spoke up again, more insistent this time. Whatever this room contained, it wasn't her business. In places like the Edgewater, there were territories, and people like Meg survived by understanding which territories belonged to them and which absolutely did not. This door, this room, this mystery, it lived in a territory so far from hers they might as well exist in different countries. She stood up, brushing dust from her uniform pants, and this time she really did start walking toward the freight elevator. Her shift was over. She had clocked her hours. She had scrubbed and restocked and organized. She had performed all the small, invisible labors that kept luxury hotels running smoothly, that allowed guests to believe in the fantasy of effortless perfection. She had done her job. The freight elevator doors opened with their usual grinding complaints, revealing an interior of scratched metal and motivational posters from corporate that no one ever read. Meg stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, she caught her reflection in the dented, metal distorted, stretched, barely recognizable. For just a moment, she wondered what her life might look like if she were the kind of person who didn't just wonder about hidden doors, but actually found ways to open them. The elevator descended, carrying her toward the time clock, toward the employee exit, toward her car in the lot where staff parked, as far as possible from the elegant entrance where guests arrived. But something had shifted inside her during those few minutes in the corridor. Something small and persistent, like a stone in her shoe that she could feel with every step. The ground floor employee area smelled like industrial detergent and old coffee. The time clock sat on the wall next to the bulletin board, covered in mandatory OSHA posters, the schedule for next week, and a faded notice about the Employee Assistance Program. "We care about your wellness," that everyone knew was just legal protection for the hotel. Meg pulled her time card from the slot, Torres M., her name reduced to 9 characters and a comma, and fed it into the machine. The mechanical stamp crunched down with a sound like bones breaking, printing 2354 in red ink that looked like a wound. She was sliding the card back into its slot when she noticed the maintenance schedule posted next to the time clock. It was a dense grid of rooms, tasks, dates, and employee codes that she normally ignored. But tonight, her eyes caught on something, a notation in the section marked Service Corridor 3 West that read Lock Repair Door 3W17 postponed until further notice. Vashford, Door 3W17, the hidden door. It had a designation, an official designation, which meant it existed in the hotel's systems, which meant there were records, maintenance logs, possibly even blueprints. But the repair was postponed until further notice by Victor Ashford himself. Why would a general manager personally postpone a routine lock repair in a service corridor? Meg pulled out her phone battery, now at 21%, she noted, and snapped a photo of the maintenance schedule. The flash reflected off the plastic protective cover, and she had to take a second picture, angling to avoid the glare. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she had to grip the phone tighter to keep it steady. This was stupid, probably completely meaningless. But that stone in her shoe had grown larger, more insistent, impossible to ignore. She shoved the phone back in her bag and headed for the exit. The rain was still falling, and the parking lot was a field of shallow puddles that reflected sodium lights in shivering orange pools. Meg's Cara 2003 Honda Civic with rust eating the wheel wells and a passenger window that only rolled up if you pulled on it while pressing the button, sat in the back row, surrounded by similar vehicles that told the same story. People working jobs that barely covered rent and groceries, let alone car payments or savings accounts. But she didn't get in the car. Instead, Meg stood in the rain, letting it soak through her thin jacket, feeling the cold water run down her neck and along her spine. She was thinking about something her grandmother had told her years ago, back in El Paso, and Meg was maybe 7 or 8. They'd been walking past a fancy restaurant, the kind with white tablecloths visible through tall windows, and young Meg had pressed her nose against the glass, watching wealthy diners eat food that looked like art. Her grandmother had pulled her away gently and said, "Mila, remember this. The people who serve the food see everything the people eating it want to hide. Invisibility is a superpower, but only if you choose to use it." At 7, Meg hadn't understood. At 43, standing in a Seattle parking lot while rain plastered her hair to a skull, she understood perfectly. She got in her car, turned the ignition. The engine coughed twice before catching, a sound she'd learned to recognize as probably fine but concerning, and sat there, with the heater blowing air that wouldn't be warm for another 5 minutes. Through the windshield, streaked with rain, she could see the Edgewater Hotel rising against the night sky, its windows glowing with the warm promise of comfort and safety that money could buy. The iconic structure, built partially over the water, looked like it was floating, an illusion created by clever architecture and carefully maintained lighting. Most people saw luxury when they looked at buildings like this. Meg saw something else, the thousands of hours of human labor required to maintain the illusion. She saw Julissa scrubbing toilets at 6 a.m. She saw Marco replacing air filters in 100-degree mechanical rooms. She saw herself restocking tiny bottles of overpriced shampoo and folding washcloths into perfect thirds. She saw the architecture of inequality held up by invisible hands. And somewhere inside that building, there was a room that wasn't supposed to exist, locked with a brass key, containing something important enough that a general manager visited it at midnight with an expression that combined satisfaction and shame. Meg put the car in reverse, pulled out of her parking spot, and drove toward the exit. The windshield wipers beat a rhythm that almost matched the rain. "What are you doing? What are you doing? What do you're doing?" She didn't have an answer. Not yet. The next morning arrived grey and wet, as if the previous night had simply continued without pause. Meg's alarmed. The harsh digital beeping of her phone ragged her from sleep at 5:30 a.m., and for the first few seconds, she couldn't remember why her body felt so heavy, why her mind felt tangled. Then she remembered the corridor, the door, Victor's face, the light leaking from underneath. Sanor Whiskers sat on her chest, his orange bulk making breathing difficult, his green eyes staring at her with the supreme indifference that only cats can achieve. "You're crushing my sternum," Meg told him, and he began to purr, which she had learned to interpret as "I know, and I don't care." She scratched behind his ears, the left one with the torn tip from some long-ago fight, and he increased his purr volume until he sounded like a small motorcycle. Her studio apartment in Rainier Valley was a single room with a kitchenette against one wall, a bathroom barely large enough to turn round in, and a window that overlooked a parking lot and, if you craned your neck, a sliver of actual sky. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor, an elderly Vietnamese woman named Mrs. Nguyen, already up and moving around, the sound of her morning routine as familiar to Meg as her own heartbeat. The rent was $1,350 a month, which was somehow both too much and a bargain for Seattle, and Meg had lived here for 6 years, without once feeling like she could call it home. She fed Sanor Whiskers. He preferred the seafood medley, consumed exactly half of it, then walked away as if offended by the remaining half-and-made coffee in the French press her sister had given her 3 Christmases ago. The coffee was cheap stuff from the grocery store, but she'd learnt to make it strong enough that the quality almost didn't matter. She drank it black, standing by the window, watching rain turn the parking lot into an abstract painting of greys and blacks. Her shift didn't start until 3 p.m., the afternoon to midnight rotation that played havoc with her sleep schedule, but came with a differential of $1.50 more per hour. That gave her the entire morning to do something she knew was probably foolish, but couldn't seem to stop herself from doing. She opened her phone battery at 67% after charging overnight and pulled up the photo she'd taken of the maintenance schedule. She zoomed in on the notation about door 3W17. The image was slightly blurry, but she could make out the essential information. The door was officially designated. It had a scheduled lock repair that was postponed indefinitely, and Victor Ashford had personally signed off on the postponement. Meg opened her laptop, an ancient Dell that took 3 minutes to boot up and made concerning whirring sounds when stressed, and searched the Edgewater Hotel Seattle history. The results were extensive. Articles about famous guests, the hotel's unique waterfront location, its reputation as one of Seattle's most iconic properties. She clicked through several links, skimming past glowing reviews and promotional material, until she found something more interesting, a blog post from a former maintenance worker who had compiled floor plans and architectural details. The blog was amateurish, clearly someone's passion project, with a black background and neon green text that made her eyes hurt, but the content was gold. The former worker, someone named Dennis Kowalski, who had apparently worked at the Edgewater for 30 years before retiring, had posted scanned blueprints from various renovation projects, along with rambling commentary about how the hotel's architecture had changed over decades. Meg scrolled through pages of detailed floor plans until she found the third-floor service corridor. There it was, a long hallway connecting the freight elevator to various storage rooms, janitor closets, and mechanical access points. But in the section marked 3 West, where door 3W17 should be, according to the maintenance schedule, the blueprint showed only blank wall space. No door, no room, just corridor. She sat back, coffee cup suspended halfway to her mouth, staring at the screen. The blueprint was dated 2008, from a renovation project that had modernized the hotel's service areas. If door 3W17 didn't exist in 2008, that meant it had been added later, possibly without updating the official architectural records. Or it had existed before 2008 and been deliberately removed from the updated plans. Either way, someone wanted that room to remain invisible. Meg clicked to the next page of Dennis Kowalski's blog, where he'd written a long post titled "The Edgewater's Secrets, Rooms That Aren't Rooms." She leaned forward, reading quickly. "In my 30 years maintaining this beautiful property, I learned that luxury hotels have layers most guests never see. There are the public spaces, lobbies, restaurants, guest rooms, designed to create specific emotional experiences. There are the service spaces, corridors, mechanical rooms, storage designed for pure utility. But then there are the in-between spaces, the places that exist in administrative limbo, rooms that used to be one thing and became another, spaces that were built for purposes now obsolete, but never officially decommissioned. I always call them ghost rooms, places that appear on some records but not others, that have keys but no listed key holders, that consume electricity and HVAC but don't appear on consumption reports. Every old hotel has them. The Edgewater has more than most." The post continued with several examples. A room on the 5th floor that had been a manager's apartment in the 1970s, but was now supposedly storage, except Dennis had noticed that someone still cleaned it regularly. A section of the basement that was marked as condemned, but clearly had working electrical outlets and fresh paint. A suite on the 7th floor that didn't appear on any reservation system, but occasionally showed signs of occupancy. Dennis Kowalski had concluded the post with a line that made Meg's skin prickle. "If you ever want to really understand a place, don't look at the official maps. Look at where the maps are incomplete." She closed the laptop and sat in the grey morning light, listening to rain hit the window and Mrs. Nguyen moving round next door and Sinner, Whiskers scrunching dry food he'd previously rejected. Her coffee had gone cold. She drank it anyway, barely tasting it, her mind spinning through possibilities. Victor Ashford had access to a room that didn't appear on official floor plans. He visited it late at night when the building was quiet. He used an old-fashioned brass key, not the electronic key cards the hotel had switched to years ago. He'd personally postponed maintenance on the lock, keeping it in its current state, unpredictable, controllable only by someone with the physical key. What did you keep in a room like that? Meg's phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from her sister, Maria, who lived in Portland with her husband and 2 kids, and a life that looked, from the outside, like everything Meg's wasn't. "Morning. Still on for Sunday dinner. Kids miss their tie letters," Meg typed back. "Wouldn't miss it. Love to everyone." She added a heart emoji because Maria liked them, even though Meg had never quite understood the appeal of tiny cartoon images meant to convey complex emotions. Another text came through, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "Staff meeting mandatory, 2 p.m. today. Attendance required." Here Meg frowned. Staff meetings were usually announced at least a week in advance, posted on the bulletin board along with the schedules. Mandatory meetings called with less than a day's notice usually meant something bad: layoffs, policy changes that would make their jobs harder, or some new efficiency initiative that translated to more work for the same pay. She replied with a simple "confirmed" and set the phone down. The clock on her ancient microwave read 7:43 a.m. She had more than 6 hours before she needed to be at the hotel. 6 hours to either forget about the hidden door and the mystery it represented, or to do something monumentally stupid. Meg had never thought of herself as particularly brave. She'd never been the kind of person who spoke up in meetings or questioned authority or made waves. She'd learned early from her mother, from her grandmother, from every job she'd ever worked, that survival for people like them meant keeping your head down, doing your work, and not asking questions about things that didn't concern you. Invisibility wasn't just a strategy, it was a lifeline. But something about last night had lodged itself under her skin like a splinter. Maybe it was Victor's expression, that unguarded moment of satisfaction and shame. Maybe it was thinking about Julissa, fired over 2 bottles of water, while managers ate free meals in the staff cafeteria and expensed $100 dinners to client relations. Maybe it was her grandmother's words about invisibility being a superpower, and the implied second half of that statement, but only if you choose to use it. She stood up, dumped her cold coffee in the sink, and made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She was going to find out what was in that room. Meg arrived at the Edgewater Hotel at 1:15 p.m., 45 minutes before the mandatory meeting, and almost 2 hours before her shift officially started. The rain had paused, leaving the city wrapped in thick grey clouds that looked like quilts made of concrete. She parked in her usual spot at the back of the employee lot and sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, reminding herself that she could still change her mind. She could walk in, attend the meeting, clock in for a shift, do her job, go home. The safe path was still available. Instead, she grabbed her bag and headed for the employee entrance. The ground floor break room was already filling with staff for the mandatory meeting. Meg recognized most of them, Rosa and Carmen, from housekeeping. Both in their 50s, with hands roughened by years of cleaning chemicals. Marco from maintenance, barely 25, but already moving like a much older man, his shoulders permanently hunched from years of bending into tight spaces. James, one of the night's security guards, a black man in his 60s who'd worked at the hotel since it opened and had stories about every inch of the property. Yasmin from the front desk, impeccably dressed as always, her hijab a deep blue that matched her uniform. Everyone looked tired and vaguely worried. Mandatory meetings never brought good news. Meg grabbed a chair in the back row and pulled out her phone, pretending to check messages while actually watching the room fill. She was looking for one person in particular, Sophie Chun, who worked in housekeeping but had a side job as a locksmith. Meg had heard about it through the staff gossip network, how Sophie made extra money helping people who'd lock themselves out of apartments or cars. She had tools, knowledge, and most importantly, a certain flexible attitude toward locks that suggested she might be willing to help with projects that existed in ethical gray areas. Sophie entered the room at 1:38 p.m., carrying a cup of coffee from the staff machine and looking like she hadn't slept well. She was in her early 30s, short and compact, with black hair cut in a practical bob and hands that were never quite still, always fidgeting with something. Meg waited until Sophie sat down, then casually moved to the empty seat beside her. "Hey," Meg said quietly. "Didn't expect to see you this early. You're usually night shift, right?" Sophie nodded, sipping her coffee with the desperation of someone running on empty. "Yeah, but mandatory means mandatory. I've been up for 28 hours straight. This better be quick." "Probably won't be," Meg said. "When has management ever valued our time?" Sophie snorted, a sound of recognition and resignation. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching more staff file in. Then Meg said, keeping her voice casual, "Hey, I heard you do locksmith work on the side. That true?" Sophie's eyes cut toward her, suddenly alert despite the exhaustion. "Maybe. Why?" "Just curious," Meg said. "I've been thinking about getting my apartment lock changed." The landlord's been weird about who has keys, and I don't trust it. It was a plausible lie, but Sophie didn't look entirely convinced. Before she could respond, Victor Ashwood entered the room, followed by Patricia Morrison, the hotel's HR director, a white woman in her late 40s who wore expensive suits and had perfected the art of delivering bad news with a sympathetic smile. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Victor began, standing at the front of the room with his hands clasped in front of him, the picture of professional concern. "I know you're busy, and I promise to keep this brief." Meg watched him carefully. In the fluorescent light of the break room, with 24 tired employees staring at him with varying degrees of suspicion, Victor looked exactly like what he was, a manager who'd practiced his empathetic expressions in a mirror. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His suit probably cost more than Meg made in a month. His watch, she could see it now, a Rolex, gold and heavy, called to light like an announcement of worth. This was not the man she'd seen in the corridor last night. That man had been unguarded, vulnerable, human. This was the performance. "As you know," Victor continued, "the hospitality industry has faced unprecedented challenges over the past few years. While the Edgewater has remained strong, we've had to make some difficult decisions to ensure our long-term sustainability and competitiveness." There it was, the language of corporate inevitability. Meg felt her stomach tighten. Around the room she could see other staff members tensing, exchanging glances, preparing for whatever blow was coming. Patricia Morrison stepped forward, her smile perfectly calibrated to convey concern without actual empathy. "We want to be transparent with you about some changes that will be implemented over the next quarter. First, we'll be restructuring our benefits package. This includes modifications to health insurance coverage, which will now require higher employee contributions, and adjustments to our PTO accrual rates. Higher employee contributions, adjustments to PTO accrual." The language was deliberately vague, designed to obscure the simple truth. They were cutting benefits and reducing paid time off. Meg did quick mental math. If her insurance contribution went up, even $50 a month, she'd have to cut something from her budget. Groceries probably. Or the medication she took for her thyroid condition. Or cat food for Cena Whiskers, though she'd go hungry herself before she'd let him suffer. Additionally, Patricia continued, still wearing that awful smile, "we'll be implementing a new efficiency protocol for housekeeping and maintenance staff. This will involve time-tracking software to optimize task completion and ensure we're meeting our service standards with maximum effectiveness." Meg glanced at Rosa and Carmen, saw the fury building behind their carefully controlled expressions. Time-tracking software meant they'd be monitored constantly, their every movement measured and judged. It meant being written up if they spent too long on a room that was particularly filthy, or if they took an extra minute to help a guest who had questions. It meant being treated like machines instead of humans. "We understand these changes may be difficult," Victor said, taking over again with his practiced sincerity, "but they're necessary to keep the Edgewater competitive and to secure all of your jobs long term. We're a family here, and families make sacrifices together. Family." Meg felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. She thought about Julissa, fired over 2 bottles of water, thought about Marcos mysteriously disappearing over time, thought about Victor standing outside a secret room at midnight with an expression that combined satisfaction and shame. Families don't lie to each other about ghost rooms filled with things they don't want anyone to see. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, more corporate language about synergy and optimization and stakeholder value, more reassurances that were clearly lies, more questions from staff that received answers designed to say everything and nothing. Meg stopped listening. Instead, she watched Victor, studied the way he moved and gestured and performed concern. She watched Patricia Morrison, whose job was apparently to smile while taking things away from people who had almost nothing. She watched her fellow employees, saw resignation settling over them like dust, saw the small defeats written in slumped shoulders and tired eyes. When the meeting finally ended and people began filing out, Meg turned to Sophie, who was draining the last of her terrible coffee, with a grimace. "That apartment lock," Meg said quietly. "Actually, it's not for my apartment. I need your help with something else, something that might matter." Sophie looked at her for a long moment, and Meg saw calculation happening behind those exhausted eyes. Finally, Sophie said, "How much?" "I can pay you $200, Meg said, which was almost all she had in savings, the emergency fund she'd been building for 5 years. "And I can tell you why it matters, but not here." Sophie glanced around the break room, at the OSHA posters and the motivational signs, and the suggestion box that no one had put a suggestion in for years, because everyone understood it was purely decorative, staff parking lot. She said, 20 minutes. You're driving. 23 minutes later, Meg and Sophie sat in the Honda Civic in the far corner of the employee parking lot, rain beginning to fall again in a drizzle that turned the windshield into a watercolor painting. Sophie had her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between curious and guarded, and Meg realized she had to make this pitch carefully. Trust wasn't something you asked for in places like this. It was something you earned through shared grievances and demonstrated solidarity. "You saw that meeting," Meg began, keeping her hands on the steering wheel, even though the engine was off, needing something to hold on to. "You heard what they're doing. Benefits cut, insurance costs up, time tracking software to squeeze every last second of productivity out of us. Meanwhile, Victor walks around with a $20,000 watch on his wrist and talks about how we're a family." Sophie nodded slowly. "Yeah, story of my life, story of all our lives. So what? You want me to help you key his Mercedes? 'Cause I'm too tired for petty revenge, Meg. I need actual sleep." "No," Meg said. "I want you to help me open a door." She told Sophie everything. The corridor last night, Victor emerging from the hidden door, the brass key, the light leaking from underneath, the maintenance schedule notation, the blog post about ghost rooms, the floor plans that showed blank wall space where a door clearly existed. She told it quickly, watching Sophie's expression shift from skeptical to intrigue to something harder and more calculating. When Meg finished, Sophie was quiet for a long moment, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the Edgewater Hotel rising against grey sky. Finally she said, "Let me make sure I understand. You want to break into a room that officially doesn't exist, that the general manager personally guards with a brass key, that probably contains something he really doesn't want anyone to see, and you want to do this in the middle of your shift, in a hotel full of security cameras and staff who could report us. Is that about right?" "Yes," Meg said simply. "Why?" It was the right question, the essential question. Meg thought about Julissa and Marco and all the small injustices she'd filed away like receipts. She thought about the meeting they'd just sat through, about benefits being cut while management talked about family and sacrifice. She thought about her grandmother's words about invisibility being a superpower. But more than any of that, she thought about Victor's expression in the corridor, that combination of satisfaction and shame that meant he knew what he was doing was wrong, but did it anyway because he could. "Because I'm tired of being invisible for their convenience," Meg said. "Because if there's something in that room that explains why they can afford to cut our benefits while he wears a Rolex, I want to know what it is. Because maybe, just maybe, there's something in there that could actually change things instead of just making us feel helpless." Sophie studied her face, and Meg forced herself not to look away, to meet that scrutiny directly. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 30 seconds, Sophie uncrossed her arms and said, $200, like you offered. But also, if we get caught and fired, you'll help me find another job. Deal? Deal? Meg said, and they shook hands in the front seat of the Honda while rain drummed overhead like applause. The plan was absurdly simple, which Sophie said was the only kind of plan that had any chance of working. Complicated plans required too many things to go right, too many variables to align perfectly. Simple plans just required nerve and timing. Meg would clock in for her shift at 3 p.m. as scheduled. She'd spend the first hour doing her normal duties, restocking the third-floor pantry, organizing supplies, being visible and unremarkable. Sophie, who wasn't scheduled to work until 7 p.m., would enter through the employee entrance at 4:15 p.m., wearing her housekeeping uniform, carrying a caddy of cleaning supplies. No one would question it. Staff came and went at odd hours all the time, especially housekeepers covering for absent colleagues or handling special requests. At 4:30 p.m. exactly, Meg would position herself near the service corridor intersection where she could watch for approaching staff or management. Sophie would work on the lock of door 3W17. If the lock was as old as the brass key suggested, Sophie estimated she could open it in under 2 minutes. They'd enter, photograph whatever was inside, and leave. Total time in the room, 5 minutes maximum. Then Sophie would relock the door, and they'd both go about their shifts as if nothing had happened. Simple doesn't mean easy, Sophie said, as they reviewed the plan one more time. If someone comes down that corridor while I'm working on the lock, we're finished. If the door is alarmed, likely in a service area, but possible, we're finished. If Victor happens to decide to visit his secret room right then, we're extremely finished. I know, Meg said, and you're sure you want to do this? Because once we start, we can't unstart. Meg thought about the mandatory meeting, about Patricia Morrison's sympathetic smile while taking away their benefits, about Victor's performance of empathy that was really just contempt wrapped in expensive fabric. I'm sure, she said. At 3 p.m., Meg clocked in and began her shift. Her hands were shaking slightly as she restocked the third-floor pantry, counting miniature bottles of vodka and gin and whiskey that cost $15 each and contained maybe 2 ounces of liquid, roughly $120 per pint, she calculated, which was 4 times what she paid at the grocery store and probably 20 times what the hotel paid wholesale. Everything in this place was a markup, a calculation of how much you could extract from people who had enough money that they stopped thinking about cost. She organized coffee pods, aligned them in perfect rows like soldiers. She refilled the small refrigerator with overpriced bottled water, $6 each. Another calculation that made her jaw tighten. She wiped down already clean counters, swept an already clean floor, performed the rituals of service work while her mind spun through everything that could go wrong. At 4:10 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie, entering now. Meg's heart rate kicked up immediately, her body flooding with adrenaline that made her fingertips tingle. She forced herself to finish organizing the pantry with deliberate slowness, to not rush, to maintain the appearance of someone doing routine work. At 4:22 p.m., she locked the pantry and began walking toward the service corridor, carrying her supply caddy as covered just another staff member moving through the building's invisible spaces. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual pitch, and somewhere in the building's infrastructure, pipes knocked softly as hot water moved through them. Meg positioned herself at the intersection where the corridor made its T-junction, where she could see both approaches, and pulled out her phone as if checking messages. To any casual observer, She was a bored employee killing time between tasks. At 4:28 p.m., Sophie appeared from the direction of the freight elevator, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged exactly where she was. She carried a housekeeping caddy loaded with spray bottles and rags, and as she passed Meg, she gave the tiniest nod ready. Meg watched Sophie approach door 3W17, watched her set down the caddy and pull something from her uniform pocket. From this distance, Meg couldn't see the details, but she knew Sophie was inserting her lockpick tools into the old brass mechanism. She saw Sophie's shoulders hunch slightly in concentration, saw her hands make small, precise movements. 30 seconds passed, 45. Meg's palms were sweating. She kept her eyes moving, watching both approaches to the corridor, expecting at any moment to see another staff member, or worse, Victor Ashwood himself coming around the corner. 1 minute. Sophie was still working, and Meg could see tension in her posture now, frustration in the set of her shoulders. The lock was being difficult. Every second stretched into elastic eternity. Then footsteps. Someone was coming from the direction of the main service elevator, their shoes making soft sounds against linoleum. Meg's stomach dropped. She couldn't see who it was yet. They were still around the corner, but she could hear them getting closer. She pulled out her phone and typed frantically, "Someone coming." Sophie's head snapped up. For one terrible second, they made eye contact across the corridor, and Meg saw her own fear reflected in Sophie's face. Then Sophie scooped up her caddy, moved 3 steps down the corridor to a janitor's closet, opened it, and stepped inside as if she'd always intended to get supplies from there. The footsteps rounded the corner, revealing Marco from maintenance, carrying a toolbox and moving with his characteristic hunched gait. He nodded at Meg as he passed, "Hey," and she returned the nod, forcing her expression to remain neutral, casual, bored. Marco continued down the corridor, past the janitor's closet, where Sophie was hiding, past door 3W17 with its invisible outline, and disappeared around the far corner. Meg waited until his footsteps faded completely. Then she waited another 30 seconds to be sure. Finally she typed, "Clear." Sophie emerged from the closet, returned to door 3W17, knelt again with her tools. This time, her movements were faster, more aggressive, and Meg could practically feel her frustration from 20 feet away. The lock was old, unpredictable, fighting back. Another minute passed. Meg's shirt was damp with sweat, despite the corridor's cool temperature. Her throat felt tight. This was taking too long. They needed to abort, try another day, rethink the plan. Then she saw Sophie's body language change, a sudden relaxation, a quiet victory. Sophie turned the door handle, and it moved. The door opened inward, revealing darkness beyond, and Sophie looked back at Meg with an expression that combined triumph and terror. Meg abandoned her position and walked quickly to the doorway. Up close, she could see Sophie's hands were shaking, see the sheen of sweat on her forehead. 2 minutes, 40 seconds, Sophie whispered. Way too long. We need to be fast. They stepped inside together, and Sophie pulled the door mostly closed behind them, leaving it open just a crack so they wouldn't be locked in. Meg fumbled for a light switch, found it on the wall, not a modern switch, but an old rotary dial, and turned it. An antique brass lamp on a side table came to life, casting warm amber light across a room that absolutely should not exist. It was like stepping through a portal into a different era, a different reality. The floor was polished mahogany, covered partially by an expensive Persian rug in deep burgundy and gold. The walls were paneled in dark wood and covered with framed photographs, dozens of them, maybe 100, arranged in careful rows like a gallery. An old oak desk sat against the far wall, its surface covered with ledgers, file folders, and what looked like antique record books. A tall filing cabinet stood in the corner, its drawers slightly open, and on the wall above the desk, a large corkboard covered with papers, photographs, and colored string connecting various elements like a detective's murder board. "Holy shit," Sophie breathed. "What is this place?" Meg moved to the corkboard first, her photographer's instinct telling her this was important. This was the heart of whatever secret Victor was keeping. Up close, she could see it was a complex web of information, names written on index cards, dates, dollar amounts, photographs of people she didn't recognize, guests she assumed, wealthy-looking men and women in expensive clothes. Red string connected certain names to certain dates. Yellow string connected others to dollar amounts. Blue string formed a separate network that Meg couldn't immediately pass. She pulled out her phone and began photographing everything, trying to capture the entire board in a series of overlapping shots. Sophie moved to the desk and started photographing the ledgers, flipping pages quickly while holding her phone steady. One index card on the board read, "Harrison's Suite, 712 March 2019, $15,000. Cash incident contained." Another, "Westbrook Party, May 2021, $8,500. Damages plus discretion." A third, "Morrison Incident July 2018, $22,000. Police not called, matter resolved." Internally, Meg felt cold understanding washing over her. This wasn't just a secret room. This was a record of secrets, a carefully maintained archive of incidents that had been buried, problems that had been solved with money and silence. The amounts were staggering: $15,000, $22,000. She photographed every card she could see, her hands moving mechanically while her mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. "Meg," Sophie said urgently from the desk. "Look at this." Meg joined her, and Sophie pointed to an open ledger filled with handwritten entries in meticulous script. The columns were labeled date, guest name, room number, incident type, resolution cost, staff involved, gratuity retained. That last column made Meg's vision narrow. Gratuity retained. She scanned for the entries, hundreds of them, going back years. "They're keeping tips," Sophie said, her voice shaking with rage. "Look, guest left $500 for housekeeping staff, $350 retained for incident fund, $150 distributed. Guest left $1,200 for concierge team, $900 retained, $300 distributed." They're skimming tips meant for staff and using them to pay off incidents. Meg photographed page after page, her hands moving faster now, urgency overriding fear. The amounts added up to tens of thousands of dollars, money that should have gone to workers like them, but instead had been diverted to cover up wealthy guests' indiscretions, to pay for silence, to maintain the hotel's spotless reputation. Another ledger showed found items, high value, a list of things guests had left behind or lost: jewelry, watches, cash, electronics. But instead of being turned into lost and found, these items had been logged here, in this secret room, with notes like retained or held, pending inquiry, that never came, or, most damning, sold discreetly, funds to reserve account. They were stealing, not just skimming tips, actually stealing high-value items that guests had lost, selling them and pocketing the money. And based on the dates in the ledgers, this had been happening for decades. This wasn't Victor's invention. He'd inherited it, maintained it, perfected it. "We need to go," Sophie said, checking her phone. "We've been in here 4 minutes." But Meg had moved to the filing cabinet, pulled open the top drawer, and found something that made her breath catch. File folders, each labeled with a name and date. She pulled one at random. "Tune Investigation, 2017. Inside were documents related to an employee theft investigation. Sophie's last name was Chun. Meg realized with ice forming in her stomach. She read quickly. Accusations of stealing supplies, of formal investigation. Termination recommended, but then mysteriously dropped after Sophie agreed to repay $800 for items she insisted she'd never taken. "Sophie," Meg said quietly, "there's a file on you." Sophie came over, took the folder, read it with an expression that progressed from confusion to understanding to pure fury. "They accused me of stealing cleaning supplies, made me pay $800 to keep my job. But I didn't take anything. I told them that over and over, but they said they had proof. And now, ... She gestured at the ledger on the desk. "Now I know where that $800 went. Into their secret slush fund." Meg pulled another file. Ramirez 2020. Julissa Ramirez, fired for taking water bottles, except according to the documents in this file. The real reason Julissa was fired was because she'd witnessed a guest assault a housekeeper and had wanted to report it. The water bottle incident was fabricated, manufactured evidence to justify termination of an employee who threatened to expose something the hotel wanted buried. File after file, Meg found variations of the same story. Employees accused of minor infractions. Investigations that felt designed to intimidate rather than discover truth. Terminations or voluntary resignations that always seemed to coincide with someone seeing or knowing something inconvenient. The files went back 20 years, maybe longer. She didn't have time to check them all. "This is a system," Meg said, her voice sounding strange and distant in her own ears. "This whole room is a system for maintaining control. They skim tips to fund their secret accounts. They steal from guests and sell the items. They fabricate accusations against employees who threaten to expose problems. They pay off incidents involving wealthy guests and keep meticulous records of it all. This isn't just corruption, it's institutional." Sophie was photographing the filing cabinet labels, getting evidence of how extensive the archive was. 6 drawers, she said. "Probably hundreds of files. Decades of this. Meg, if we can get this out, if we can show people." The door opened. Victor Ashford stood in the doorway, his hand still on the knob, his expression cycling through surprise, fury, and something that looked almost like admiration, before settling into cold calculation. "Well," he said quietly, "this is unfortunate." For one frozen moment, nobody moved. Then Victor stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and the soft click of it latching sounded like a cell door closing. He looked at Sophie first, then at Meg, taking in their phones, the open drawers, the evidence of their invasion scattered across every surface. "I came back to retrieve a file," he said, his voice still quiet, controlled. "I occasionally check this room to ensure everything is in order. And instead, I find 2 employees committing breaking and entering, theft of confidential documents, and industrial espionage. Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Meg found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. "Do you have any idea how serious what's in this room is? Tips stolen from staff, items stolen from guests, employees falsely accused and fired, incidents covered up with cash. This is evidence of crimes, Mr. Ashford. Multiple crimes spanning years." Victor's expression didn't change. "This room contains confidential hotel business records, personnel files, incident reports, financial documentation. Everything here is perfectly legal and part of standard luxury hotel operations. You, on the other hand, broke into a secured area, accessed confidential materials, and are attempting to steal proprietary information. I can have security here in 2 minutes, police in 5. You'll both be arrested, charged, and prosecuted. And trust me, with your histories," he glanced at Sophie, "juries won't be sympathetic." Meg felt panic rising but forced it down. He was trying to intimidate them, to make them feel helpless and cornered. But her phone was still in her hand, still recording. She'd started voice recording the moment Victor stepped through the door, a reflex she'd later recognize as the single most important decision she'd make in her life. Standard operations don't require secret rooms that don't appear on floor plans, Meg said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Standard operations don't involve keeping decades of records on employees you've falsely accused. Standard operations don't include ledgers showing gratuity retained, which is a nice way of saying tips you stole from workers who make $15 an hour, while you wear a watch that costs more than our annual salaries combined. Something flickered in Victor's eyes, respect, maybe, or calculation. He moved further into the room, positioning himself between them and the door. You're a clever woman, Meg. I've noticed that about you. Quiet, observant, smart enough to stay under the radar, but you've made a serious miscalculation here. This room, these records, they exist because luxury hotels serve a particular clientele. Wealthy, powerful people who expect their indiscretions to be handled with discretion. When a senator's son trashes a suite or a tech CEO's mistress causes a scene, or a celebrity guest needs a problem to disappear, we handling it for 50 years. Every luxury hotel in every major city has some version of this. It's how the industry works, by stealing from your own employees, Sophie said, her voice sharp with anger. By falsely accusing people who can't fight back. By covering up assaults and crimes because the perpetrators have money. Victor shrugged, a gesture that was somehow more chilling than any threat. By maintaining the standards that keep this hotel profitable, which keeps you employed. Every dollar in that reserve account comes from excess tips that were more than generous, items that were never claimed, settlements that were mutually beneficial. And yes, sometimes we have to manage problematic employees who don't understand how to maintain discretion. It's all part of the ecosystem. He pulled his phone from his pocket, and Meg's heart seized. But instead of calling security, Victor held it up so they could see the screen, a security camera feed showing the service corridor outside. I've been watching this corridor on the camera system since I left my office 15 minutes ago, he said. I saw you arrive, saw Sophie pick the lock, very impressive. By the way, saw you enter. I've recorded everything. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to delete every photo and recording on your phones. You're going to leave this room. You're going to resign from the Edgewater, effective immediately, with no severance and no references. And in exchange, I won't press charges, won't report you to the police, and won't ensure that every hotel in Seattle knows you're thieves who can't be trusted. That's the deal. Take it, or spend the next 5 years in legal hell that will bankrupt you and destroy any chance you have of normal employment. Meg looked at Sophie, saw her own despair reflected there. He had them. They had evidence of his crimes, but he had evidence of their breaking and entering. It would come down to their word against his, their stolen photographs against his legitimate authority, their desperation against his expensive lawyers. They would lose. People like them always lost to people like him. Unless, what about the employees whose tips you stole? Meg heard herself say. What about Julissa Ramirez, who you fired on false pretenses because she witnessed an assault? What about the guests whose jewelry and cash you sold? What about all the people you've hurt with this system? Do they get any justice, or does your discretion only protect the wealthy? Victor's expression hardened. Those people are collateral damage in a business that's more complex than you understand. Now delete your photos, or I make the call. Meg looked at her phone, at the recording app still running in the background. She'd gotten everything: Victor's admission about the room's purpose, his explanation of the system, his acknowledgement of stolen tips and falsified accusations. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. She met Sophie's eyes and saw the same desperate calculation happening there. Okay, Meg said, infusing her voice with defeat. We'll delete everything. Just ... Don't call the police. We can't afford lawyers. We'll resign. We'll go quietly. She made a show of pulling up her photo gallery, of selecting the images she'd taken in the room, but instead of deleting them, she quickly airdropped them to Sophie's phone, then airdropped Sophie's photos to her own phone, creating redundant backups. She saw Sophie do the same, their movements small and quick, hidden by the angles of their bodies. Done, Meg said, showing him her photo gallery, now apparently empty of the incriminating images. Sophie. Done, Sophie confirmed, holding up her phone as well. Victor nodded, satisfied. Smart choice. Now get out, both of you. And remember, if a single word of what you saw here ever surfaces, I have the security footage of you breaking in. I will destroy you, completely. Understand? They understood. They walked past him, into the corridor, and the door closed behind them with that same soft click. Meg's legs were shaking so badly, she had to lean against the wall for a moment, drawing deep breaths. Sophie grabbed her arm, steadying her, and they walked together toward the freight elevator. Two employees leaving their jobs, their dignity apparently intact, but their futures uncertain. It wasn't until they were in the parking lot, standing by Meg's Honda in the rain that had started up again with renewed intensity, that Sophie said, "You got it, right? Tell me you got the recording." Meg pulled out her phone with trembling hands and opened the voice memo app. There it was, 8 minutes and 43 seconds of Victor Ashford explaining exactly how his system of corruption worked, admitting to stolen tips and falsified accusations and covered-up crimes. His voice was clear, unmistakable, damning. "I got it," Meg said, and for the first time in hours, she felt something that wasn't fear. "I got all of it." They didn't resign. They didn't disappear quietly. Instead, over the next 12 hours, they did something that Victor Ashwood's system hadn't prepared for. They went to someone who existed outside the hotel's hierarchy of power, someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from burning the structure down. Leo Castellanos had worked at the Edgewater Hotel for 38 years, starting as a bellhop in his 20s and working his way up to head porter before retiring 5 years ago at the age of 62. But retirement for Leo hadn't meant golf and grandchildren. It had meant becoming president of the Hospitality Workers Union Local 10047, a position he'd taken specifically because he'd spent 4 decades watching workers get exploited, and had decided he was done being quiet about it. Meg had met Leo twice, once during her initial orientation 8 years ago, when he'd still been working, and he'd given her a knowing look that said he understood exactly how hard her job would be. And once at a union meeting she'd attended out of curiosity 2 years ago, he'd remembered her name. He'd asked about her family. He'd given her his personal cell phone number and said, "If you ever see something that needs daylight, call me, anytime, day or night." She'd tucked the number into her phone's contacts and never thought she'd use it. But at 7:30 p.m., sitting in her apartment with Sonor whiskers on her lap and Sophie on her couch and the recording playing through her laptop speakers, Meg scrolled to Leo's name and pressed call. He answered on the second ring. "Leo Castellanos." "Mr. Castellanos, this is Meg Torres. I worked at the Edgewater. You gave me your number and said to call if I ever saw something that needed daylight. Well, I'm calling." 45 minutes later, Leo sat in Meg's tiny studio apartment, his large frame making her second-hand couch look like doll furniture, listening to the recording for the 3rd time while studying the photographs on her laptop. He was a big man, with grey hair worn in a neat ponytail, weathered brown skin that spoke of decades in the sun before hotels became his life, and eyes that were simultaneously kind and absolutely uncompromising. When the recording finished, he sat back and let out a long breath. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "According to the ledgers, at least 20 years, Meg said. "Possibly longer." The filing cabinet had 6 drawers full of employee files going back decades. The tip skimming, the selling of guest property, the cover-up sits, all systematized. Victor admitted, "It's been maintained for 50 years. Leo nodded slowly, and Meg could practically see him processing, strategizing, planning. "You know this is going to get ugly," he said finally. "Victor's right about one thing. You did break into that room. A prosecutor could potentially press charges, although I doubt any DA would touch it, given what you found. But the hotel's lawyers will try to discredit you, paint you as disgruntled employees with an axe to grind. They'll dig into your backgrounds, your finances, your personal lives. They'll make it as painful as possible." "I know," Meg said. "And you're willing to go through that anyway." She thought about Julissa, fired on false pretenses, about Sophie, forced to pay $800 for theft she didn't commit, about Marco's disappeared over time, and Rosa's stolen tips, and all the small cruelties that added up to a system designed to keep people powerless. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." Leo looked at Sophie, who nodded as well. "Yes, whatever it takes." "Okay," Leo said, and his voice carried the weight of someone making a commitment he intended to keep. "Here's what's going to happen. Tonight, I'm going to call my contact at the State Labor Board and my contact at the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. Tomorrow morning, we're going to arrange for you two to give formal statements and turn over all this evidence. By tomorrow afternoon, there will be federal auditors crawling through the Edgewater's financial records. By tomorrow evening, this will be on the news. And by the end of the week, Victor Ashford will be explaining to a federal prosecutor why he thought stealing from employees and guests was standard luxury hotel operations." He paused, making sure they were both paying attention. "But you need to understand something. This won't just affect Victor. This is going to expose the whole system. Other managers probably knew. Corporate probably knew. This could bring down the entire executive structure of the hotel. It's going to be chaos." "Good," Sophie said fiercely. "Let it be chaos. Maybe, out of the chaos, something better can grow." Leo smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment for years. "I've been organizing hospitality workers for 5 years now, and you know what I've learned. Power protects power until something breaks the system open. You just found the crowbar. Now let's use it." The storm that had been threatening Seattle for days finally arrived in full force just after 9 p.m. that night. The wind came first, rattling windows and tearing leaves from trees, followed by rain so heavy it turned streets into rivers and overwhelmed storm drains. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and lightning illuminated the city in strobing flashes that made everything look like a photograph being taken over and over. At the Edgewater Hotel, the storm caused a power fluctuation at 9:47 p.m., and for 3 seconds, every light in the building went dark. Emergency generators kicked in immediately, but in those 3 seconds of complete darkness, several things happened almost simultaneously. Victor Ashford, who had been in his office reviewing security footage and planning his next moves, realized that if federal auditors were coming, and Leo Castellanos' union had enough political connections that auditors would definitely be coming, he needed to eliminate the evidence in the secret room, not just remove it, destroy it. He grabbed his brass key and headed for the third-floor service corridor. At the same time, Meg sat in her apartment, giving her formal statement to Agent Patricia Chun from the FBI's Seattle field office, who had arrived with remarkable speed once Leo made his phone calls. The recording played again, and Agent Chun took meticulous notes, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes reflecting something harder, the look of someone who'd just been handed a career-making case. And in the hotel itself, word was spreading. Leo had made dozens of phone calls, activating a network of current and former Edgewater employees who had been organizing quietly for months, waiting for an opportunity. By 9 p.m., 23 staff members knew about the secret room. By 9:30, 47 knew. By 9:45, more than 70 employees understood that something was happening, that the system that had kept them down for so long was finally breaking, and that they needed to be ready. When the power flickered and the lights went out, Marco from maintenance, who had spent 15 years watching his overtime disappear into administrative shadows, made a decision. He was in the basement mechanical room when the darkness hit, and he made sure the emergency generators took just a little longer to kick in than usual. 4 seconds instead of 3. Just enough time for some things to happen that wouldn't happen in the light. Victor reached the third-floor service corridor in the darkness, using his phone's flashlight to navigate. He didn't notice that he wasn't alone in the corridor, that shadows contained people who had every reason to make sure he didn't reach that room. The lights came back on. Victor stood in the middle of the corridor, surrounded by 8 employees. Rosa and Carmen from housekeeping, James from security, who had decided his loyalty to workers outweighed his loyalty to management. Yasmin from the front desk, Sophie, who had come back to the hotel specifically for this moment, and 3 others, maintenance staff, kitchen workers, people whose names Victor probably didn't know because he'd never bothered to learn them. They didn't touch him, didn't threaten him, just stood there blocking the corridor in both directions, making it clear that he wasn't going anywhere near that room. "Get out of my way," Victor said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "All of you. This is insubordination. I'll have you all terminated." "With what?" James asked, his deep voice calm and measured. "With the records you kept in the secret room. The ones that prove you've been running a criminal enterprise. Those records." Victor's hand went to his vest pocket, to the brass key, and Meg saw him realize that his power, the power that had seemed absolute for so long, was actually fragile. It depended on people like them accepting their place, staying quiet, remaining invisible. And they were done with that. "The FBI is on their way," Sophie said. "Federal agents, Labor Board investigators, the union's lawyers. They'll be here within an hour. And when they get here, they're going to seal that room and everything in it as evidence. You can try to destroy it, but you won't get past us. And if you try to run..." She gestured down the corridor, where more employees were gathering, drawn by some instinct that important things were happening in the building's invisible spaces. "Where exactly are you going to run to?" The storm outside intensified, and somewhere in the building, another power fluctuation made the lights dim for just a moment before stabilizing. In that dimness, Meg saw Victor's face cycle through emotions: rage, calculation, fear, and finally resignation. He was trapped by the very system he'd maintained, caught between employees who refused to move and authorities who were closing in. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The hotel will fight this. Corporate has lawyers who will bury you all. You think you've won something, but all you've done is ensure that the Edgewater closes and everyone loses their jobs." "Maybe," Rosa said, speaking for the first time, her accent thick but her words clear. "Or maybe the hotel gets new management. Maybe we get a union contract. Maybe things change. But even if it closes, even if we all lose our jobs, at least we'll lose them with our dignity. At least we'll know we tried to make things right instead of just accepting how things were." Victor looked at her, and for just a moment, Meg saw something human flicker across his face, maybe understanding, maybe regret, but then it was gone, replaced by the mask of professional authority one last time. "Fine," he said. "I'll wait for the authorities in my office. But this isn't over." He turned and walked away. not toward his office but toward the emergency exit stairwell, and Meg understood he was going to run. But Marco was already moving, phone to his ear, and she heard him say, "He's heading for the parking garage. Make sure he doesn't leave." Through the building's windows, lightning illuminated the city, and thunder rolled like a judgment. The storm reached its peak intensity, rain hammering against glass with violence that sounded like applause. The FBI agents arrived at 10:23 p.m., led by Agent Chun and accompanied by 2 forensic accountants, a labor board investigator, and Leo Castellanos, who carried himself with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting years for this night. They sealed door 3W17 with official notices, stationed a guard outside, and began the methodical process of cataloging evidence that would take weeks. Victor Ashford was detained in the parking garage, where he'd been attempting to leave in his Mercedes, despite Marcos's call that had brought 2 patrol officers to block the exit. He didn't resist. By that point, he seemed to understand that resistance was pointless. The brass key was confiscated from his vest pocket, and he was taken to the federal building for questioning. By midnight, the storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean and glistening. The news vans arrived at 12:47 a.m., having picked up the story from police scanners and FBI press releases. By 1 a.m., the first news reports were broadcasting. Federal investigation underway at iconic Seattle hotel, allegations of systemic theft and employee abuse. Meg watched it all from the employee break room, where she sat with Sophie and Liam and a dozen other staff members who had stayed through the night, watching their workplace transform from a place of quiet oppression into a crime scene. She felt exhausted, hollowed out, strangely numb. 8 years of invisibility had ended in one night of exposure, and she wasn't sure yet what that meant for her future. "You did something important tonight," Leo said, sitting down next to her with 2 cups of terrible coffee from the staff machine. "You need to understand that. Most people spend their whole lives seeing injustice and staying silent because speaking up seems too hard or too dangerous. You saw something wrong, and you did something about it. That's rare. I'm probably going to lose my job," Meg said. "The hotel might close. All these people." She gestured at the employees around them, some sleeping on break room chairs, others watching news coverage on their phones, all of them caught in the chaos they'd helped create. "They might all lose their jobs because of what I did." Leo shook his head. "They might lose jobs at a place that was stealing from them and treating them like they were expendable. That's not the same as losing something valuable. And whatever happens next, they'll face it with the truth, out in the open instead of buried in a secret room." He was right, Meg knew. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. She sipped the terrible coffee and watched the news coverage and wondered what came next. What came next was 3 months of investigation, testimony, negotiation, and restructuring. The FBI's forensic accountants traced the secret room's financial records back 23 years, uncovering $2.7 million in stolen tips, $843,000 in unreturned lost property that had been sold, and $1.4 million in payoffs related to incident cover-ups. Victor Ashford was charged with wire fraud, embezzlement, theft, and racketeering. He would eventually plead guilty and receive a 7-year federal prison sentence. The hotel's corporate ownership, facing criminal liability and devastating publicity, agreed to a settlement with the state labor board and the union, $4.8 million in restitution to current and former employees whose tips had been stolen, mandatory unionization of all non-management staff, termination of the entire executive team, and the creation of an employee ethics committee with real power to investigate complaints and recommend policy changes. The Edgewater didn't close. Instead, it underwent what the news called a revolutionary transformation. New management committed to transparent operations, union contracts that ensured fair wages and benefits, and a complete overhaul of the culture that had allowed systematic abuse to flourish for decades. Julissa Ramirez received a formal apology, $47,000 in back wages and punitive damages, and was offered her job back at a 30% pay increase. She accepted. Sophie Chun received $14,000 in restitution and a promotion to housekeeping supervisor. She accepted that too. And Meg Torres, the quiet pantry worker who had noticed a hidden door and chosen to investigate instead of ignore, received something she hadn't asked for but found she desperately wanted: an invitation to serve on the new Employee Ethics Committee as its founding chair. On a grey February morning, 4 months after the night everything changed. Meg sat in the hotel's conference room, formerly an executive-only space, now open to all staff, with the other committee members, reviewing their first quarterly report. The committee had received 47 complaints about working conditions, investigated all of them, and resolved 39 through mediation and policy changes. The remaining gain were being escalated to the new management team, which was contractually required to respond within 10 business days. It wasn't perfect. There were still problems, still inequities, still moments when Meg felt exhausted by the weight of trying to change a system that had decades of momentum behind it. But it was different, fundamentally, structurally different. The invisible workers were visible now. Their voices mattered, and when someone reported a problem, there was a mechanism to address it instead of a secret room where it would be buried. At the end of the meeting, Meg raised one more item for discussion. "I want to propose a scholarship fund," she said, "for the children of hotel workers, housekeeping, maintenance, food service, anyone who works in non-management positions. Full scholarships for community college or vocational training, funded by the hotel as part of their commitment to investing in workers and their families." The committee discussed it for 45 minutes. By the end, they had a proposal: the Edgewater Workers Educational Fund, seeded with $500,000 from the hotel's settlement money and sustained by annual contributions of 1% of the hotel's profit. It would provide 20 scholarships per year to children of current and former employees. "How do we present this to management?" asked Michael, a maintenance worker who'd joined the committee after years of quietly witnessing Marco's stolen overtime. "We don't present it as a request," Meg said. "We present it as a requirement, as part of the transformation this place committed to, as the price of moving forward instead of staying mired in what was." She wrote up the proposal that afternoon, sitting in the third-floor pantry during her break, the same pantry where she'd worked for 8 years while remaining invisible. The proposal was 10 pages long, detailing the fund's structure, its financing, its selection criteria, and most importantly, its purpose: to ensure that the children of hotel workers had opportunities their parents never had, that the next generation wouldn't have to choose between dignity and survival. The new management team accepted the proposal in full 4 days later. The first 20 scholarships were awarded in September. Meg attended the ceremony, watching young people, the sons and daughters of housekeepers and cooks and maintenance workers, receive checks that would pay for their education, that would open doors their parents had only been able to dream about. She saw Rosa crying as her daughter accepted a scholarship for nursing school. She saw Marco's nephew receive funding for an electrical apprenticeship program. She saw Sophie's niece get money for community college, the first person in her family to attend any form of higher education. After the ceremony, Leo found Meg standing by the window, looking out at Elliott Bay, where the water reflected grey sky and distant mountains. "You changed lives tonight," he said simply. "Not just these 20 kids. All the kids who'll come after them. All the parents who will know their children have a chance. You changed the story." Meg thought about the night in the corridor, about the hidden door and the brass key, and Victor's expression that combined satisfaction and shame. She thought about her grandmother's words, "Invisibility is a superpower, but only if you choose to use it." She'd spent 8 years invisible, learning the building's secrets, understanding how power worked in the spaces where luxury met labor. And then, for one critical night, she'd chosen to use that invisibility to leverage what she'd seen and learnt, to break open a system that had seemed unbreakable. "I just noticed a door," she said quietly, "and decided to see what was behind it. That's all it takes sometimes," Leo said. "Someone willing to look at what everyone else has learned to ignore. Someone willing to ask why things are the way they are. Someone willing to believe that change is possible, even when every system is designed to convince them it's not." Outside, the Seattle rain began, again gentle this time, a whisper instead of a shout. Meg watched drops streak the window, watched the city blur and sharpen, like a photograph being taken over and over until it finally captured something true. She still worked the third-floor pantry, still stocked miniature bottles and folded washcloths and restocked coffee pods. But she wasn't invisible anymore. None of them were. They'd stepped out of the shadows, where luxury hotels kept their labor hidden, and they'd proven that the people who served the food really did see everything the people eating it wanted to hide. And sometimes, if they were brave enough, they chose to tell the truth about what they'd seen. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that ordinary people can create extraordinary change, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Subscribe to this channel to follow more stories about courage, justice, and the power of choosing to act instead of remaining silent. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters, that their observations have value, that invisibility can be transformed into power if we choose to use it. Because in the end, every system of injustice depends on good people deciding that speaking up is too dangerous, too costly, too difficult. And every transformation begins when someone decides that staying silent is even more dangerous than the risk of being heard.